Listen closely, my friend, for I will tell you the story of a war that changed the world forever. World War I began in 1914 and continued for 4 terrible years, ending only in 1918. But the war did not appear from nowhere. Europe had been growing increasingly tense for many years. Powerful nations competed for territory, influence, military strength, and control of distant lands. Nationalism also grew stronger, making people increasingly determined to defend the honor of their own nations. And behind the tension stood powerful military alliances, ready to pull one country after another into war. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance, although Italy would later change sides. Opposing them stood France, Russia, and Britain, united through the Triple Entente. Then, on June 28, 1914, a single assassination became the spark that ignited Europe.
In Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived with his wife, Sophie. Among the people was a young nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, whose actions would change history.
Princip assassinated Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, sending shockwaves through the governments of Europe. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and demanded action, while Europe watched nervously. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia supported Serbia and began mobilizing its enormous army. Germany supported Austria-Hungary and declared war on Russia, then turned toward France. To reach France, German forces invaded neutral Belgium, changing the course of the war. And Europe was now fully at war. What had begun as a dispute between two countries had become a massive international conflict. In the West, German forces met the armies of France and Britain, and the battlefield soon became a nightmare. Instead of quickly defeating one another, both sides dug deep trenches and prepared to hold their ground.
Life inside those trenches was miserable, surrounded by mud, rats, disease, cold, and constant fear.
Between the opposing trenches lay no man's land, a deadly open space few soldiers could cross safely. Machine guns unleashed devastating fire, making every attempt to cross the battlefield extremely dangerous. Then came the thunder of artillery, shaking the earth and destroying trenches, roads, villages, and lives. The Battle of Verdun became one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the entire war. Then came the Battle of the Somme, where enormous numbers of soldiers were killed or wounded. World War I also introduced weapons that transformed modern warfare forever. Poison gas was used against soldiers, creating terrifying conditions on the battlefield. Tanks appeared on the battlefield, designed to cross trenches and barbed wire that stopped ordinary soldiers. Far from the trenches, submarines hunted ships beneath the oceans. But the war was no longer confined to Europe. Fighting spread across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, bringing the conflict deep into the Middle East. At Gallipoli, Allied forces attempted a difficult campaign against Ottoman defenses. Men from India, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and many other lands were sent to fight. Behind every soldier stood families waiting anxiously for letters that might never arrive. Millions were wounded, displaced, or killed, while nations struggled to continue supplying the war. For years, the United States watched the conflict from across the Atlantic. German unrestricted submarine warfare increasingly threatened American ships and interests. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, further convincing American leaders that Germany posed a serious threat. In 1917, the United States officially entered the war on the side of the Allies. Fresh American troops and enormous resources strengthened the exhausted Allied armies. But another great power was collapsing. Russia was being torn apart by revolution. After the Bolsheviks came to power, Russia withdrew from the war. With Russia gone, Germany moved troops west and launched a final major offensive. But Germany's soldiers were exhausted, and supplies were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. Then the Allies began pushing forward, supported by fresh American troops and overwhelming resources. Germany's allies began collapsing one after another, and the Central Powers could no longer continue. Inside Germany, hunger, economic hardship, political unrest, and military defeat created a deep national crisis. Kaiser Wilhelm II eventually abdicated, as Germany's old political order began to collapse. Then, on November 11th, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. Then, the armistice was signed, ending 4 years of unimaginable destruction. Across the battlefields, soldiers learned that the war was finally over. But peace came at an enormous cost. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died. Europe was exhausted, its cities damaged, its economies weakened, and its people deeply traumatized. In 1919, the victorious nations gathered to decide the future of the defeated powers. The Treaty of Versailles placed severe military restrictions, territorial losses, and financial burdens upon Germany. 4 great empires had fallen: German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian. New countries emerged, borders changed, and the political map, Ottoman, was transformed. Leaders also created the League of Nations, hoping that diplomacy could prevent another world war. Yet the peace that followed was fragile. because many problems remained unresolved. In Germany, resentment grew over the harsh terms imposed after the war. Economic hardship and political extremism would eventually create new dangers for Europe. 2 decades later, Europe would again descend into a much larger global conflict, World War II. World War I showed humanity the terrible consequences of nationalism, military rivalry, and uncontrolled international tensions. Millions of ordinary men were sent into battle, many never returning to their families. An entire generation carried the scars of the conflict, long after the battlefield became silent. Today, memorials across the world remember those who lost their lives during those terrible years. And so, the story of World War I became a warning, passed from one generation to another. And so, war does not only destroy armies, it changes families, nations, borders, and the lives of people who survive. And so, war does not only destroy armies. We should remember not only how it began, but what it cost. Remember the millions who never came home. War does not only that peace is precious, because history has shown us how quickly it can disappear.